welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today, we're going to be talking about Dark Side of the Ring, the episode on Chris Candido and Tammy Lynn Sitch. So, let's talk about this. As usual, I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow. I'm going to just basically give a cursory review. It was a pretty good episode, but the teeth of Dark Side of the Ring have been removed. The teeth and the claws of this show have pretty much been removed. It's pretty obvious that at this point, they're trying to stay away from being too incendiary. Let's put it like that. I mean, they still put some heat on some people that they felt probably deserved having heat. But in terms of going as hard as they usually would, they didn't. In addition to that, this episode was far more about Chris Candido than it was about Tammy. The creators of Dark Side of the Ring, they did an interview with Jim Cornette where they explained that because of Tammy's recent issues with the law, she essentially has been getting talked about a lot in the media. That's the first thing. The second thing is she wasn't able to participate because, and they said it in this episode, on the advice of legal counsel, she decided not to participate in Dark Side of the Ring. So basically all they used was some shooter interview clips of Tammy. And that made the episode feel very short and also made it feel more disconnected than usual because none of the primary people are involved and only Chris Candido's brother, and I think his mom is there, but his mom is kind of on the outside too. But his brother gives some really good insight here. Now, there are some things that they talked a lot about the drug use between the two of them. They didn't go into any real detail about where the drugs came from, though. There's a Chris Candido interview that exists out here on the internet. It's like a 3-hour interview. I haven't listened to the whole thing, but it essentially tells the genesis of his drug use. That it began in the WWF, which is something they said in the documentary. And it began because the WWF's rings were super hard and they were working pretty much every night and they were traveling a lot. So Chris was having a tough time and eventually he ended up breaking his neck in that ring. And he said that Scott Hall gave him a Xanax. And because he was clean at the time, he really kind of tossed and turned about whether he was actually going to take it or not. He called Dr. Tom Pritchard and Tom Pritchard actually took it from him and, flushed it or whatever. Later on, Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, ended up giving him a Xanax bar, and that was the first time he had ever taken it. And it spiraled out of control from there. In relation to Tammy, she started doing drugs because he said there was a lot of pressure on her due to her looks. So the company was pushing her because of her look, and she traveled a lot. And basically, she was under a lot of pressure to stay in shape, which I think is something she talked about in an interview about when she left WWE. She found cheeseburgers, I think she said it was something like that, and she started eating differently when she left WWE because she didn't have to be small anymore. And she started doing drugs socially because everybody around her was doing them, and because she was under a lot of pressure and she kind of wanted to escape that pressure. But there was a lot of talk about drugs in here, but there was no talk about Louis Spicolli. Louis Spicolli, believe it or not, there was a storyline during the 1995 Body Donna's era where Louis Spicolli was Rad Radford, and Rad Radford was a Body Donna in training. Now, you may have said, well, who is Louis Spicolli? Well, he was a jobber in the WWF, but he was sort of one of those guys that a lot of indie wrestlers, a lot of wrestlers at the time were friends with, good friends with Tommy Dreamer and a lot of guys in ECW. He died of a drug overdose. Shortly after he got to ECW, he was fired from WWE for drug use, and he went to ECW and eventually he overdosed. Now, Chris Candido talked about that and said, even though how close they were, it didn't stop them and from doing drugs as much as they was. It just kind of made them peel back. And I think his exact words were, maybe we ought to take 5, not take 1,000 like we used to, because nobody wants to end up like Louis Spicolli. So that became how ECW became the home of all the drug addicts. And Chris talked about pretty much everybody except Taz was screwed up in ECW. And that tracks with everything that I know about ECW. So we learned that, the WWF had, of course, their guys who did a lot of drugs, British Bulldog being one of them, from crack cocaine to alcohol to Xanax, of course. Scott Hall, who learned about learned about pills from Mr. Perfect, who was either still there or about to go. I think he might have been still there in '95 when Chris Candido was there. Of course, Sean was doing coke in the back, doing coke and pills backstage. Even Viscera was doing coke and pills. It was a real drug culture, almost like it was in the '80s. The '80s had like a really crazy drug culture, and in the '90s had a really crazy drug culture too. And Chris Candido just kind of got caught up in all of that. And he felt like the WWF specifically singled him out. And that's why he was, sort of de-pushed, because he got the label of being the screwed up wrestler. He wasn't high enough on the card that it would matter. He felt like he could be the guy that could be punished. I guess he was saying, without saying it, that Sean was screwed up too, but Sean is Sean. And since I'm way down here, they figured they'd make an example out of me. Now, Jim Cornette, he's talked a lot about this Chris Candido thing, but he had something on a drive-through episode a couple of years ago. This was, I don't know if it was last year or maybe 2 years ago, about Louis Spicolli and WWE. And it says, quote, Vince McMahon hated Louis Spicolli, just couldn't stand him. That drug-addled, quote unquote, me, Bruce Pritchard, Jim Ross, and Vince were in Anaheim one day on the way to a taping or a pay-per-view or something. We passed Chris Candido and Tammy and Spicolli, who had already left the company. But we're in California, so he's riding with them to the show to visit. And that's the first time I've seen Vince pop, that drug-infested son of a bitch. Spicolli just got under his craw for whatever. So Spicolli, who was already gone at this point, still friends with Chris and Tammy, and kind of like Spicolli's heat kind of rubbed off on them. Nobody ever mentioned that before. That would have been nice to mention in this Dark Side of the Ring episode, even though it would have been a lot of speculation, but there is, some reason to believe that. So I can see that being the case. One thing, to sort of pivot away from the drugs a little bit, one thing that I noticed that I never really thought about is how young Chris Candido was when he died. He was only 33. I'm older than that now. This is a guy who was in WWE and he was in his really early 20s. I think they said he was 24 or something like that when he got to WWE. And he achieved his dream pretty quickly, so there's something to be said about that. They talked about, it didn't spend a lot of time on the Body Donnas in the documentary. There's not much to be said. They were fitness gurus. This was a stark difference from the character that Tammy had done in Smoky Mountain, when she was essentially a feminist. She was an obnoxious liberal feminist, sort of an Anna Kasparian type of character, really looking up to Hillary Clinton and all that kind of stuff, which was crafted by Jim Cornette as a way to piss off the hillbilly wrestling fans in Smoky Mountain. And it's really wild that if you learn a little bit about Smoky Mountain, how Jim Cornette crafted a lot of those characters to make fun of his audience, which I'm not surprised that the company died at that point. He told New Jack to go out there to piss off the old white folks who was coming to these shows. And then he sent Tammy out there to piss off all the guys who were coming to these shows. So it was like, there's good heat, good wrestling heat that you want to see these people get beat up. And then there is, smacking them in the face, paintbrushing them every week. It's a fine line between the two, but Tammy was really good. Like if you saw the clips of Tammy being this liberal, over the top, feminist college student, because she was only like 19 at the time, she was really good in that role. At this point, for some reason, Chris Candido had a baby bonnet on his head. I don't know. For everybody who claims that this guy was going to be like the next so-and-so and such, I have notoriously not seen that much in Chris Candido. That's just me personally. No offense to anybody who was a huge fan of his. I just don't see why you would be. He's just another wrestler guy, as far as I'm concerned. Skip was probably the only thing that he actually done. I know he was an NWA champion, but that didn't mean anything. Not at that time. This was after Shane Douglas had threw the belt down already. So that didn't matter. He went to ECW at a time and he did okay, I guess. That's really what people are mostly remember is that, his run in ECW, under No Gimmicks Needed or the Triple Threat with, what was it? Him, Shane Douglas, and Bam Bam Bigelow. So, he did some stuff, but I just don't have really fantastic, over the top, verbose things to say about Chris Candido. And that's really what I think hampered the episode is people talked a lot about Chris really just loved wrestling. He was a super fan from when he was a kid to the point where he was an adult. His brother even said that, hey, one time Chris had a seizure and they trying to ask him what his name was and all this kind of stuff. He went over to Chris and said, how many times did Ric Flair win the NWA title? And Chris was like 16. And he's like, oh, well, he's alive. He's okay. Like, he can answer that kind of question. He doesn't know where he is, but he can answer questions about wrestling. And it's a very sweet sentiment, but it's the similar thing to what I've been saying about some of these NXT talents and some of these other kinds of talents where just because wrestling is your dream and you're athletic, it's not enough. It's not enough. And unfortunately, knowing that he only died at 33, he had a shot, I guess you could say, with the body donnas, but then all the ugly stuff happened between Tammy and Sean and a bunch of other stuff happened. So how much of a chance was it really? And he was trying to get himself back on track when he went to TNA. So it was basically like the guy didn't really get much of a chance. 33, you're still very young. So it's hard for me to see what everybody else saw, but at the same time, he was very young. He had plenty of time to sort of grow into the guy that everybody loved. Now, of course, they talked a little bit, just a little, about Tammy's cheating. Essentially, the way Tammy tells it, she and Sean had a relationship that lasted about 9 months. And Sean was doing stuff on TV. Like, there's the whole thing where apparently he was fingering her on TV during, Shotgun Saturday Night or something like that. It's a clip. You'll probably see it online. They would tease that they would do stuff on television. And apparently, according to Tammy, she and Chris were broken up during this time. And Chris never asked, and she never told him anything. And that was that. There was a time where they weren't together anymore. She was seeing Sean, and then when that was over, she went back to Chris, I guess, apparently. But that's not what most people believe. Most people believe that they were never, because they were still going to hotel rooms together. They were still traveling together. They still lived together. As far as I know. So the idea of Chris Candido being cucked by Shawn Michaels, essentially that is true. Most people tend to believe it that way. They did not go as far as to talk about maybe other people that she supposedly had, screwed around with at the same time. For instance, of course, it's just speculation, but like Raven has said that he went up to, when she was working in WWF at the time, he was screwing around with her then. He was working in ECW at the time. There was some other people, but it might just be things where, guys are being guys and yeah, I had her too, bro. But a lot of these dudes it's a drug circle. And in the documentary, they talk about this thing where Chris would be in the ring wrestling in ECW and Tammy would be backstage with other people. They implied that she was doing stuff. That's what they were implying, that Tammy was cheating on him while he was in the ring. And that's dark. Like, that's really dark. Especially considering she claimed that this whole thing with Sean was during a break or a breakup between the two of them or whatever. Now in her book, she went into some really graphic detail about this sexual relationship with Sean. It's really insane. I suggest, if you want to know a little bit more about it, that you find the Bruce Pritchard episode of Something to Wrestle, where they talk about Tammy's book and Conrad actually reads it out. I have, a PDF copy of the book. It is graphic. I'll try to be tasteful until we get to a certain part. Well, she starts talking about, initially, she was a wrestling fan too when she was a youngster. And she fell in love with Shawn Michaels when she saw him on AWA TV. So she finally gets to meet him in WWE, and she's at this time 21. He's in his 30s, I think, maybe late 20s. And they have to do some kind of kissing scene on television. And he says to her, "So what kind of kiss can I give you?" "Any kind of kiss you want," she replied. And he says, in the sexiest voice I could conjure up, giving him a little wink and a smile. Then she gushes over the kiss for a while. And then she says, "The next week on TV, I was standing by the curtain watching the show, as we all usually do, and Sean walked up behind me to look and watch over my head. And as he inched closer to me, I could feel his hot breath warming the hairs on the back of my neck. 'Do you feel that?' he whispered. That," he was referring to, was his hard dick pressed firmly against my ass. "Oh yes, I felt it all right, good and hard." That's just the beginning of how vulgar this thing gets. As a matter of fact, let's continue. So she says, "Instantly I was turned on. I was moist. What red-blooded American girl wouldn't have been when the Heartbreak Kid pushes his erection up against you and gives you chills with his breath? I had a pretty good idea where this was going and what his intentions were. And I was right. Later that evening, he pulled me into an empty locker room and kissed me and felt me and groped me. And then, like a kid in high school, he fucked me. Yep, he banged me good right there in the locker room. It was so dirty and sexy and so not allowed within the crew that it made it even hotter. Oh my God, it was mind-blowing sex. And that was the beginning of the love affair that would eventually lead to my first broken heart ever. I was 23. He was 31. She goes into how other people knew. Apparently Vince knew. Apparently the 1-2-3 Kid knew. He was the guy watching the door. And she says, "I was still on the road with Chris, keeping up the charade, so no one knew about me and Sean, especially Chris. Even though we were just cohabitating, I didn't see any reason to upset him." So she lived under the idea that Chris never knew. A lot of people seem to have the idea that Chris didn't know. But unless Chris Candido is as oblivious as Dale Gribble, from King of the Hill, I don't see how you couldn't know. I don't see how you couldn't know. But this thing, they didn't go into any real detail about it in the in the documentary, because clearly they just wanted to talk about Chris. And Tammy is just a part of Chris's story. He's a significant part of Chris's story because everybody quickly recognized, even at the very beginning, she got far more over than he did. She achieved far more than he did. And she fucked up far more than he did, if we being honest. So of course they talked about his death. They didn't go into any real detail about him dying. Just that he was in a cage match in TNA. He was trying to bump around a cameraman when he snapped his fibula and tibula in his leg. He had surgery. He was back 2 days later. Then he got on an airplane, which is not advised for you to get on an airplane right after you have surgery. Once he got home, he started feeling ill. Blood clot had traveled from his ankle to his heart, gave him pneumonia, and he passed away. So it was a horrible situation. And we learned how each person that was in the story except Mick Foley. He was there, but they didn't talk to him about when Chris Candido died. Tammy was at the hospital. Chris's mom was not there, but she was on her way. Dr. Tom Pritchard had learned from a call he got from Tommy Dreamer, and his brother actually was in the hospital with him in the room when Chris took his last breath. So it was pretty awful. You know, they didn't go into any real detail about Chris's in-ring stuff like championships or anything like that. Like, he won the WWF tag team titles, but as sort of an afterthought. Of course, there's a time when nobody really cared about the tag team championships. He was also the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, but again, this was 1994. The belt had already been tossed down by Shane Douglas and pretty much kicked by every major promotion in the world. Nobody really cared about that belt at the time. So one thing that I do want to discuss, and I do think that this is partially true, is Cornette saying that the business eventually would have found a guy like Chris Candido, because in his time, he was a smaller, lighter guy who could work, and the business wasn't ready for that yet. And he's made it sound like he was sort of before his time. In 2005, around the time TNA is coming in, you do start seeing that change. I mean, he's in the same company as AJ Styles, who was being pushed as a world champion in like 2003. You know, so yeah, the business was definitely starting to change. So I see why he would think that way. Now, before we wrap it up, let's talk about ECW. Now, the ECW thing was very interesting because in ECW, they did a tell-all video series where they talked about their struggles, essentially, especially Tammy. Now, in the interview that I watched about Chris Candido, he talked about how Tammy didn't want to do this. And this is one of those times where Paul Heyman got you brainwashed. And Candido even said that too. He's like, hey, half the day we was out of our minds on drugs. The other half, Paul Heyman is in our ear, controlling us. So, you're not in your right frame of mind at any point. And so he being Paul Heyman, had talked them into doing this series of videos telling their backstories, telling them that it would make them sympathetic. And, either it's going to be sympathetic or it's going to blow up in their faces or whatever. So they sit down and they do these interviews, and Tammy's telling all of this terrible stuff about the first time she's ever had a drink, the drugs, and a bunch of other stuff. And it comes out and it's pretty embarrassing, and Chris Candido's pretty upset that she had to do it. And in her book, Tammy refers to Paul Heyman as the hypnotist. Now, this is actually something I'm going to spend a little bit of time on here, because this is actually one of the most screwed up stories I've ever heard about Paul Heyman. And it's something that nobody has ever really talked about, because I guess ECW's been gone for so long that most people and there's so many crazy stories that come out of there that people don't really notice. But she says, quote, Paul has a way of convincing people of anything. He could put dog shit on a platter and convince you a $250 plate of steak tartare. And then he had gotten her fired from WWF because she went on ECW pay-per-view and said that ECW was her new home, which is something Vince knew she was going to do because, Paul needed Vince's permission for her to be on the pay-per-view. What he didn't know is that she was basically just joining up with Chris in ECW. And so when she said that on the pay-per-view, Vince fired her. So now she's stuck in ECW with Chris and Paul Heyman. She says, quote, the first 2 months were fine. T-shirts were made, checks were given on time, and cleared at the bank. Then Paul asked her to be the, quote, travel department as well. I would use the travel agency that the WWF used and book the entire crew's flights, charge them on my American Express card, and get a reimbursement check once a month for the entire monthly bill, approximately $30,000 each month. All was really good for a few months. For a few months. Those are the key words. Out of nowhere, paychecks were late. Then our reimbursement checks were late, really late, and the lag was growing each month. Then she says, I'm going to skip a little bit. She said, then the mail came, and so did my American Express bill. There was another $30,000 charged on our bill for airline tickets. But how could that be when we weren't working or making reservations? Well, it just so happens that Paul's assistant, Debbie, started making the flights in our absence and telling the travel agency to continue charging them to the account on file, which had to be our personal account. Those bastards were not only not paying us, but now running up our American Express card and not reimbursing that. After a few months, we owed American Express $175,000. When we disputed the charges, we lost the claim because we had authorized charges for flights in the same names in the past and had no proof we didn't authorize the new charges. That's sick. That's fucked in the head. That's incredible. That's incredible. This is absolutely awful. This is what led to them going to WCW because they needed some money. He says, finally, after a month of Paul not answering our calls, he picked up the phone. We told him that if he cared about us at all, like he claimed to, he would either pay us what he owed us or give us our release so that we could start working for WCW. He said he couldn't pay us because he was already going bankrupt, but that he would give us our releases on one condition, and one condition only, that we would sign off the $175,000 American Express bill and promise we wouldn't sue him for it. That's what she claimed that Paul Heyman wanted her to do. She says that what were our options? There were no other options, either to sign off on the debt or not be able to work anywhere for another year. So Paul's attorney/father drew up the papers and we signed them. Reluctantly, we would now be liable for $175,000, but at least we can now work and make money. American Express then proceeded to sue us. Our bank accounts were depleted. All we had left was our new house. Then they had to sell the house. He said the house sold within 3 weeks of listing, so we would be able to get rid of the debt quickly. When we bought the house, I wrote a personal check for $125,000. The price was $425,000. We sold it for $525,000, but after the mortgage was paid off, American Express got their money, and all the other credit cards that we owed money to were paid. We were left with just $35,000. I had spent $125,000 out of pocket. The house sold for $100,000 more than we paid for it, and after Heyman's bill, all we had left in the world was a lousy $35,000. She says, I do have to admit ECW wasn't all that bad though. So that should tell you what the mentality of a pro wrestler is. This guy puts you in debt. And they're not the only ones. I did a video talking about some of the wrestlers that Paul owed money to. Either it was something similar to this where they were being charged personally for things for the company and it were being quote unquote reimbursed, or guys were doing extra work and then they were getting paid from the till, like Tommy Dreamer or whatever, or somebody would carry like the t-shirts or whatever, and they would just take a little extra off the top, and Paul knew it, but it was the only way of paying them. And it's the most fucked system I've ever heard. Like this is not just bad business. This is criminal acts. Now, of course, they didn't get this thing written down. If they'd have got a written contract with Paul, they probably would have had a reason to sue. But with no written contract, they were pretty screwed, right? So it says a lot that in the end, she was like, hey, I was peeled out of my mind. I got embarrassed by Paul, getting me on TV talking about the death of my niece and some other things that happened that was terrible in my life. And, he screwed me out of my brand new home and put me $175,000 in debt. But it wasn't that bad, so that should tell you the mentality of some of these people involved with these stories. Anyway, that story was told in the documentary, but there was no detail, which I would think that was something that you would go into detail with, because Paul screwing you out of money, it's not only is a tale as old as time, but it's something that would kind of explain why you will continue down the path of doing drugs, being screwed out of so much money and being angry. And they did say that one of the reasons why Chris continued to do drugs is that he was an emotional wreck. Part of it had to do with Tammy. And we already know that Tammy was doing drugs partially because, she was also an emotional wreck. So you're talking about a very difficult situation here, and Paul just kind of took advantage of him, you know? So that was very sad. All in all, though, I felt like the biography or the documentary was good. It was very short, but it had some really good clips in it. And I think there was definitely more to discuss there, at least, but that was mostly on the Tammy side. On the Chris side, I think they did the best that they could with the amount of information that they had. Because there's not a lot out there. There's, outside of the Shawn Michaels scandal and him dying and Tammy suing TNA and all that kind of stuff, it's hard to tell more about his story that didn't just turn into the Tammy story, and that's just kind of how it is. And that's very unfortunate that you try to talk about Chris, but outside of the fact that he loved wrestling and, he was a pioneer, I guess you could say, of a smaller, more charismatic style wrestler. And he was doing that at a time where it wasn't in vogue, I guess that's the story of Chris Candido, but does that mean a 45-minute documentary should be about him? It's like, not really, not when Tammy is there and she's an absolute train wreck. But there is a lot that was touched on here that was very good. So I think Dark Side of the Ring, they learned hopefully they learned their lesson from the last season or so, and they stopped jumping to so many conclusions and stopped doing business with such bad faith actors, and they actually stick to some facts, but they actually blow through things pretty quickly too, and don't take time to actually explain things. But they only have 40 minutes. Maybe this episode would have been better if it had been 90 minutes and they could have took some time to discuss more about Chris's life and his drug abuse and, losing the house and maybe their time in WCW and how things continue to spiral out of control, and actually use some of Chris's words. I think would have been very useful as well. Interviews or something that came directly from Chris probably would have been better. But all in all, I think it was fine, but what do you guys think? Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.